You're listening to member-supported jazz radio from the campus of City College, FM 88.3, KSDS, San Diego. You're listening to Sketches of Miles, an extended series of specials celebrating the life and legacy of Miles Dewey Davis on the centennial of his birth. I'm Lauren Schoenberg, and this is the very first episode where we will trace Miles's first 18 years in his native St. Louis. While there are no recordings of him at that time, we have found interviews and musical samples that will amplify how he became one of the giants of world music. Let's start with Miles in St. Louis just after his 30th birthday in 1956 with his great quintet, John Coltrane, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones. Be advised that the quality of the audio and the music are in an inverse ratio, but it's a treasure nonetheless. This is Woody and You.
Miles Davis and the Quintet, ladies and gentlemen, right in Peacock Alley on a Saturday afternoon. Here's an old Dizzy Gillespie favorite called Woodying You.
Miles Davis in St. Louis in early 1957, and it was an amazing moment for him because after a lot of starts and stops in his career that began meteorically as the trumpeter with Charlie Parker's quintet in the mid-1940s, Miles Davis was finally on his way to personal and professional success. This was the real beginning of the iconic Miles Davis that became an international figure. Now, in that particular quintet was John Coltrane, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones. And as they played that night in St. Louis, and I was about to say his hometown, but the truth is he was really raised in East St. Louis across the Mississippi River. That's in Illinois. This St. Louis is in Missouri. There were undoubtedly a lot of people who knew Miles since he was growing up and became a star in the St. Louis music scene in the early 1940s as a teenager. But there were also people who would have known of his father, who was a renowned, successful dentist and who was also, as Miles liked to say, a gentleman farmer. But there is news to share here about Miles Davis's grandfather, and I want to acknowledge right now an extreme debt to a wonderful book. Now, there's an autobiography of Miles Davis as told to Quincy Troop, but this book gets into the weeds, the real researched history. It's called Miles Davis, New Research on Miles Davis and His Circle by Masaya Yamaguchi. It came out in 2019, 2020, and it is a treasure trove of information not only about Miles, but John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Miles's family, and a lot of other people, too. I couldn't have done this particular episode without it. So I'd like to talk just for a moment about Miles Davis's grandfather, and believe it or not, Yamaguchi finds someone who believes is Miles's great-grandfather, but that's he hasn't been able actually to quite verify that yet. Miles Davis's grandfather was born in August 1870. He married in 1893. His wife's name was Mary F. Davis, not sure of her maiden name, and they were in Arkansas, and they show up in the Jefferson, Arkansas census on several occasions. Now, without getting too complicated, I'm going to read you a brief sketch about the life of Miles's grandfather from an interview with his son, Miles Davis's father, and I hope this isn't getting too convoluted for you. Miles Davis's father said, "My father, Miles I, was born 6 years after the emancipation and forbade me to play music because the only place a Negro could play then was in barrel houses. My father was the most efficient double-entry column bookkeeper in Arkansas before the coming of the adding machine, and white men came to his home under cover of night for him to fix their books. He was later driven from his extensive holdings." And in Yamaguchi's book, he goes on about how that Miles Davis's grandfather was so successful, that he owned a large piece of land, and eventually the folks who used to rely on him, the white folks, were so resentful of the money that he had made and his great success that they drove him out of the place. All of this just to underline that Miles came from a family of extraordinarily accomplished people. His great success was by no means an anomaly, given his background. Now, he did an interview in which he was talking about going to visit his grandfather in Arkansas, and there's something really, really interesting about it, because this is before he ever played the trumpet. And he said, "I also remember how music used to sound down there in Arkansas when I was visiting my grandfather, especially at the Saturday night church. Man, that stuff was wonderful." I have to say I'm leaving out some of the expletives here. "I guess I was about 6 or 7. We'd be walking down on these dark country roads at night, and all of a sudden this music would seem to come out of nowhere, out of them spooky-looking trees that everybody said ghosts live in. And we'd be on the side of the road, whoever I was with, one of my uncles or my cousin James, and I remember people would be playing a guitar the way B.B. King plays. And I remember a man and a woman singing and talking about getting down. Man, that music was something, especially that woman singing."
Mister, won't you fixin'? What make you wait so long?
Get my tools ready, lady.
Mister, won't you fixin'? What makes you wait so long? got you fixing? Tell me and I'll be moving on.
Now when I fix it, lady, sure will be mighty good. When I fix it, lady, you'll find it mighty good. I fixed so many of them all over this neighborhood.
You got your tools, mister.
That music was something, especially that woman singing. But I think that kind of stuff stayed with me. You know what I mean? The kind of sound and music, that blues, church, back road, funk kind of thing, that southern, midwestern, rural sound and rhythm. I think it started getting into my blood on them spook-filled Arkansas back roads after dark, when the owls came out hooting. So when I started taking music lessons, I might have already had some idea of what I wanted my music to sound like. Now, everything you just heard me say here, preceding the music too, in that last segment, was from Quincy Troupe's As Told to Miles Davis autobiography. And, you know, Troupe was a poet, a writer, and he poeticized a lot of the quotes from Miles Davis. And one of the things about the Yamaguchi book that I've talked about is that he goes back to the actual transcripts and kind of A and B's everything, and we see what Miles Davis actually said. But, you know, there is a poetic quality that does capture an essence there. So there's Miles Davis talking about music you heard before he started the trumpet. Now, we'll get back to that in just a moment. We talked a bit about Miles Davis's grandfather. Let's get to his father. His father was Miles Dewey Davis, and the name Miles Dewey Davis brings up a whole bunch of associations because the Spanish-American War started in 1898, and Admiral Dewey of the Navy was a huge hero in the United States at that time for that very questionable war undertaking. But nonetheless, Miles B. Davis originally was born in March 1898. Now, later on, it was turned into Miles Dewey Davis. And I'm wondering if, after he was born, they changed it because he was born a month before the stuff happened with the Spanish-American War. But anyway, I'll leave all that to historians and people who really can get into all of that. The point about Miles Davis's father is that he went far in his life from his beginnings in Arkansas. He went to college there, eventually got his dentist degree at Northwestern University in Chicago in 1924, and then settling in East St. Louis. More about East St. Louis in just a moment. He was also a member of the Elks, the Masons, the Knights of Pythias, American Woodmen, Omega Psi Phi, the NAACP. He was really something to deal with. Now, he met his wife, Cleota May Henry, in Arkansas. She was working in a doctor's office. She was a year younger, having been born in 1899. They were married in 1924, and that was the year, once again, that Dr. Davis became Dr. Davis, getting his degree in dentistry at Northwestern in Chicago. Now, they eventually wound up in East St. Louis, and there's really not time to get into it. I'm not sure it's even appropriate, really, to get into the huge difference between East St. Louis, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri. They both had tremendous racial issues, economic issues, labor issues, but St. Louis, Missouri was the place of a tremendous World's Fair in 1904. Ragtime had kind of come of age there in a certain kind of way. There were all kinds of stories about arts and culture and things like that. East St. Louis, on the other side of the Mississippi River, in Illinois, was really the creation of industry, the creation of the railroad barons of the time. There were huge slaughterhouses there, and it was a totally different kind of complexion, if you will, than St. Louis. However, there was a quite a large, well, not a large, but a very important African-American population there, and a lot of other folks. In Miles's interviews and in the Troupe book, he talks about, the neighborhood in which he grew up. It was like, not quite like the UN, but there were all different kinds of folks. It comes off, even with some of the tragic occurrences that happened in and around there, in a relatively benign manner. Well, now we have to get to the point where Miles Davis gets a trumpet. And there was a very well-respected trumpeter, well, actually he played all the instruments, music instructor in the high schools who would come visit the younger students and bring an instrument, pass out instruments for them to play, and his name was Elwood Buchanan. Now, we have Miles Davis and Clark Terry talking about this very famous educator and the way he taught. Let's start with Miles, and then we'll kind of back up a bit and hear Clark Terry talking about how he encountered the young Miles Davis and Professor, as he was called, Buchanan. This interview begins with Miles talking about when he was very young, going to practice down by the lake because his sound sounded a certain kind of way in that setting, and then he backs into eventually mentioning Elwood Buchanan.
I used to go on my father had a large farm.
Yeah, outside of St.
Yeah,
Louis.
he's gentleman farm. So we had a lake, and I used to practice that because the water makes the sound carry, but you have to hear your sound. I used to ask Dizzy, I said, why is it that I can't play like you? He said, you play the same thing I do, but you play it in the lower register. My sound comes from also my instructor, Elwood Buchanan in St. Louis. I used to love the way he would hold a horn. It's the look. You have to get that look first.
Now, that was Miles. Now, let's go to Clark Terry talking about how he heard from Elwood Buchanan about the young Miles Davis.
Miles Davis' teacher, Elwood Buchanan in St. Louis, was a good buddy of mine. We used to drink beer together, you know. And during the conversation, he'd always say, man, you got to come old school. He taught school over in East St. Louis at Lincoln High. You got to come old school and meet this little cat, Dewey Davis. His middle name was Miles Dewey Davis. And I don't know whether he was named after Dewey Jackson, the top trumpet player in the town at the time. I understand that his dad's name was Dewey also, so I'm not sure. But anyhow, he said, you got to come over and meet Dewey. So finally I found an occasion to go over there and meet Dewey Davis. So when I went over to school, there was this little kid, he must have been about this big. He was thin enough to ride a rooster.
Little skinny Miles Davis.
Yes. Yeah. So I said to him, man, are you? Yeah, I'm okay. This is before he had the real gravelly voice, you know. So I said, well, we want to hear you play something. So he started playing, and he was wailing away, playing beautifully then. But he always loved a gentleman that we all loved, Harry James. But he sort of overdosed in his appreciation for Harry James, because he used to put a vibrato on, tee, and Buke had a long ruler with a piece of tape wrapped around it. And whenever he would shake this note, Buke would wham and slap him on the finger and say, stop shaking that note. You're going to shake enough when you get old. Play it straight. So I think that the Buke's disciplining him with eliminating the vibrato, and at the same time, Buke had studied with Joe Gustav, who was the principal trumpet player with the concert band, St. Louis Symphony, and he insisted that all his pupils used Heim mouthpieces, H-E-I-M. And it was a very wafer-thin, curly-Q type mouthpiece with a deep bowl, you know. And he insisted on it. So Miles fooled around and started playing on it, got a hold on them and practically said, man, I like that. So he said, man, can you get me some high mouthpieces? But they were a little bit too thin for my child because they'd go right through like a fingernail. So I said, I'll find them for you, but I can't use them. So I found him several mouthpiece Heims. And the first thing he'd always ask me, he said, man, you got any Heims for me? Oh. And if I could fix his valves. I had a way of turning the valves, maybe an eighth of an inch, all the way around and bending them back and forth. And it made the springs a little bit lighter. You know, you could say, burp, you could almost fly, you know. And he looked forward to that and the Heim mouthpiece.
All right. Clark Terry talking about his early mentorship of Miles Davis through the mutual association with Elwood Buchanan, who was a school teacher at that point, who really influenced Miles Davis and who eventually sent Miles to his teacher. And that was Joseph Gustat. And you heard at the end of the interview there, Clark Terry talking about Haim mouthpieces to get all of this straight and to place Miles Davis firmly in this great St. Louis tradition of great trumpeters, classical and jazz. Joe Gustat was the principal trumpeter, that means first lead trumpet, with the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra for years. He eventually opened up a music shop where he taught, and he insisted that his students play a Haim mouthpiece. Now, Gustav Haim was the previous principal trumpeter way back. In fact, he had emigrated to St. Louis from Germany in 1904. He played in what became the Symphony Orchestra, played at the famous 1904 World's Fair, and in fact, he got so much acclaim that he wound up in the Philadelphia Orchestra and then with the Boston Symphony Orchestra for a long time. Now, interestingly enough, just before Miles Davis was born, across the river from East St. Louis in St. Louis, Bix Beiderbecke was there with a band, including Pee Wee Russell and Frankie Trumbauer. And the legend goes that Joe Gustat heard Bix Beiderbecke play the cornet. He was very impressed, couldn't teach him because Bix Beiderbecke had such unusual fingerings on the instrument that Gustat kind of figured, let's just leave him alone. He's a genius. He doesn't need any help. Now, also in that interview with Clark Terry, you heard the name Dewey Jackson mentioned. Now, Dewey Jackson was one of the early great trumpet players from St. Louis. And it was the proximity of the Symphony Orchestra, the great teachers that made St. Louis a legendary trumpet town in jazz. Now, this still goes to this day because younger trumpet players, and I mean, these are musicians probably in their 40s now, people like Russell Gunn and Keon Harold, who are leading lights in jazz trumpet, are from St. Louis. And all throughout the years, there was a tradition of great trumpeters coming out of that city, and Miles Davis fits right in the middle of all of that. So I'll tell you what, we're not listening to much Miles Davis today, although we are going to get to some because there are no recordings of him during those years. I'll tell you what, before we get into the great legacy of early St. Louis trumpet, out of which Miles Davis came, let's go back to that gig that he did just after he turned 30 years old, and he was just getting on that golden road of success when Miles came back to St. Louis in early 1957. Let's hear an extended version of All of You. Now, again, this is that great quintet with John Coltrane, Red Garland, Philly Joe Jones, and Paul Chambers. And it marked a moment where Miles Davis had conquered a lot of the personal issues he was dealing with up until his late 1920s, and he was well on his way. So, once again, you're listening to KSDS FM 88.3 FM in San Diego, and this is the initial broadcast part of Sketches of Miles, the beginning of dozens of programs celebrating the great, iconic Miles Davis on the occasion of his 100th birthday anniversary. You're listening to Miles at 100 right here on KSDS 88.3 FM in San Diego. And this is the very first segment of the Miles 100 series that'll be going on for months, frankly. And we heard All of You from early 1957, recorded at Peacock Alley in St. Louis. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show when we heard some of this material previously, what it lacks in acoustic quality or in hi-fi sound, whatever you want to call it, it makes up certainly in the quality of that performance. I mean, that's that early Miles Davis quintet with John Coltrane, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones. And in the audience that night, there were undoubtedly, I mean, maybe his parents were there, I don't know, but, there were people, his brother, his sister. I didn't even mention he had a sister who was a year older named Dorothy and a younger brother who was born 3 years after Miles named Vernon. They were very, very close. Lord knows that they were in the audience that night. A lot of people who knew the Davis family and their great history were there. Now, before we heard that extended performance, we heard from Clark Terry and Miles talking about Miles's teachers, Elwood Buchanan and Joe Gustat, and the classical trumpet and the mouthpiece and the great jazz players. And Clark Terry mentioned Dewey Jackson, and I think right now we should just quickly listen to the sound of jazz trumpet out of New Orleans, going back to the real grandfather, the founder of the whole thing, and his name was Charlie Kreth. Charles Kreth, and that's like breath, but with a C at the beginning. We could do a whole show about him, but let's just listen to his sound on records. He was recording as far back as 1924. He was an extraordinarily popular, great early jazz player. He played on the riverboats that went up and down the Mississippi River, and eventually settled into a great career as a band leader. Health problems away from the trumpet. He played saxophone in later years, but here's a sample of the St. Louis trumpet sound in 1924. Now let's jump just real quick to another great St. Louis jazz trumpeter named Harold Shorty Baker. Played in a bunch of great bands, most famous for his long period in Duke Ellington's band. And this will just show you how quickly the music was evolving. I mean, we heard 1924. This is 1932. And imagine when we finally get to Miles Davis in 1945. Here's just a little sample. 1932, the young St. Louis trumpeter, Harold Shorty Baker. The great Harold Shorty Baker, St. Louis trumpeter, 1932, as a very young man doing a Louis Armstrong, but with such a beautiful original tone. You know, there's a great photo of Miles in 1970, I believe it is, with Louis Armstrong in the recording studio, just looking at Louis with such love and admiration. And he eventually found his way to really appreciate and show his love for what Armstrong did. And I thought I'd just share right now some interviews with Miles, where he talks about his influences. He starts here talking about Roy Eldridge, and then he talks about Lewis and his own place and various influences. And I'll throw in just a little bit of the Roy Eldridge solo that Miles says he copied when he was a teenager, because it's hard to imagine him playing like that. But he did.
My first influence was Roy. I used to play old rocking chair. I used to play just like him. But see, if it wasn't a Roy Eldridge and a Louis Armstrong, there would be no me and Dizzy and Fats Navarro, Years ago when we started out, right? Like I said, I had about 4 or 5 records that they would come off, we'd get them off the jukebox for 5 cents. And like trumpet players, you could go with Louis, Roy, Eldridge, Harry James, but it was only one record. You know what I mean? But now it's so many records that you can. When you say keep it pure, that means that you have to copy everybody. If you're a trumpet player or a saxophone player, you can get records like this. And they'll still be cliches because they issue so many records. A guy had to play like himself in those days. My influence in St. Louis was Dizzy. The first record that I had, we only had 3 records. It was Wouldn't You with Dizzy and Coleman Hawkins. Tatum. Jay McShann. Count Basie.
Wow. So there we were listening to Miles Davis talking about the records he had, the influences, and we heard Art Tatum, we heard Dizzy Gillespie with Coleman Hawkins. Earlier we heard Roy Eldridge, and then he mentioned Jay McShann's band and Count Basie's band. Both of those bands had genius saxophone players with their own relationship, Charlie Parker and Lester Young, but nothing seems to have prepared Miles Davis for what he heard one night in 1944. Now, I should mention that, he had been playing, as he mentioned, he had a union card when he was 15 years old. That would have been 1941. going into 1942, and he was working with great bands, most notably Eddie Randall's band, and there were other famous bands with whom he was very close, like George Hudson's band. He was a rising star. We heard Clark Terry earlier in the show talking about how he encountered Miles at that time and how Miles Davis was already playing wonderfully. But then something happened that radically changed his life. So now we go to yet another interview with Miles where he responds to the question, did he first hear Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie when he moved to New York?
The feeling I got was in St. Louis, when they came to St. Louis, when Billy Eckstine came to St. Louis. But I heard Dizzy, Art Blakey, Bird, Lucky Thompson, Sarah, Gene Ammons. I heard all of them at once. I said, that's the most fun I ever had with my clothes on. Can you imagine that? But see, we were on the verge of that anyway. I knew they were playing, but I mean, it wasn't Dizzy first. It was the whole thing together, like, bam, here's what you want to be, you know? And my head just carried me right to Bird and Dizzy, another trumpet player named Buddy Anderson. So Buddy had a hemorrhage, and I joined B's band for that week. That's what it's not shock, but you know when you see somebody, say you're wearing some clothes, and you don't know whether you should wear a long coat to your knee, or a short coat, and you see somebody that has on a short coat, and you like the way they look, then it makes up your mind, you know? That only put a stamp on what I wanted to do. It wasn't in New York, it was in St. Louis. It was also a team effort. It wasn't like one individual. Earl Hines' band was the band. So Beast left Earl Hines, and he asked Dizzy and Bird and Jerry Valentine. They wrote arrangements. So that was the band, Earl Hines, you know. But it was a team effort because all of them played alike, and not alike, they thought alike. But it was a team effort.
I mean, so interesting to hear Miles Davis talking about hearing that Eckstine band. I mean, many times in later interviews, he said, you know, that he said that he never got a musical thrill equal or surpassed what he heard that night and that week that he played with Billy Eckstine's band with Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Sarah Vaughan, Art Blakey, and others. And also that it was the most fun he ever had with his clothes on. What a great way to put it. Now, earlier in today's show, you know, I was mentioning his family, and I've kind of dropped the ball there. His father died in 1962. His mother died in 1965. And in looking again at that Yamaguchi book that I've mentioned several times, there's an article, it just gives a certain picture, no humor intended, about the status of Dr. Davis. As Miles mentioned, you know, he had a farm, and he raised hogs on the farm. You won't believe this, but he actually imported the hogs from Winston Churchill's estate farm in England. Can you believe that? I mean, there's a little fact for you, but it says a lot about his aspirations and what he accomplished. All right, so Miles goes to New York in 1944 to go to Juilliard. He lasts a couple of semesters, but he falls in with Bird and Diz, and that's the end of that. So here we have another excerpt, Miles Davis, talking about a conversation with his friend Freddie Webster, and about how he's telling Freddie that he's got to tell his father about his decision not to continue at Juilliard in 1945.
So when I went to Juilliard, what they were trying to teach, I already knew. You know, so I told my best friend, Freddie Webster, he's dead now. I said, Freddie, I have to go to St. Louis. He said, why? He said, because you know what's going to happen. You know, them crackers out there, and you're going to get mad and somebody hit you over the head. I said, no, I got to tell my father that I'm going to quit Juilliard. He said, well, call him up. I said, not him. I can't call him up and tell him some like that, you know. So I took a train and went to St. Louis. He looked up and said, what are you doing here? He was doing something to somebody's teeth, you know. And he was a dentist. And I explained to him, you know, I said, listen, there's a thing going on. Now, I couldn't call him on the phone and say, you know, it's Yardbird and Dizzy. You know, he don't know. He would say, what are you talking about, you know? So I had to go there and tell him that. I just said, there's a little thing going on, and the music is changing, you know, and I'm in that environment, you know. So Juilliard was just, you know, white. It was white, you know what I mean? I couldn't get in the Philharmonic in the symphony orchestra, and I didn't want to, you know. But I had to tell my father that, you know, about Monk and Coleman Hawkins, Bird and Diz, and Bud Powell, you know.
So interesting to hear Miles talking about his conversation with his friend Freddie Webster, that he has to go back to St. Louis, tell his dad that Dizzy, Monk, Bird, and Bud are going to be his new mentors, teachers, not the folks at the Music Conservatory. Well, thank heavens that happened. Now, it's hard to believe that, you know, in September 1945, not that long after he leaves, just about a year after he leaves to go to New York, that Miles Davis is going to appear on Charlie Parker's very first record date, the one with Now's the Time and Billy's Bounce, and play some trumpet solos that are still echoed today. I mean, absolutely classic. And he was so young at that time. He was 19 then. He was 18 when he went to New York. Now, the name of this particular episode is Miles in St. Louis. And one of the problems has been that there are no recordings of him actually in St. Louis before he left for New York. However, he did make his very first commercial record session in early 1945 for the Savoy label, backing a singer named Rubber Legs Williams. Now, Rubber Legs Williams' name is well known to people who studied Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie because it's a very humorous story about a record session that happened with them slightly before this one. That's another story for another time. Miles wound up on his very first record session backing up Rubber Legs Williams along with Herbie Fields, who played very good saxophone and clarinet. The problem is there are no trumpet solos, and even when he's playing background, he's so far away. He's playing with a mute most of the time, and he's way in the background. And I even tried with some software, AI software I have, to kind of separate Miles out so we could hear him. It doesn't really work. So what I did was I took 12 bars where he is audible, playing a background, and I boosted the volume when he plays. So you're going to hear a very uneven sound here of the singer, and then all of a sudden, boop, you know, loud with the muted trumpet. But it's our only real glimpse as to how Miles sounded just as he left St. Louis and got to New York. It's only one chorus, so we'll hear it 2 times.
I cried, come back, baby. I'll tell you what I'll do. I cried, come back, baby. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm gonna fall out with my mother, my brother, my sister, everybody, just to get along with you. I cried, come back, baby. I'll tell you what I'll do. I cried, come back, baby. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm gonna fall out with my mother, my brother, my sister, everybody, just to get along with you.
And that's about all we got from the very first Miles Davis record session. That one again done with Rubber Legs Williams and the Deep Sea Blues. early 1945, which makes it all the more amazing, the growth in his style, because it was just several months later in November 1945 that he appeared on the very first Charlie Parker record session. You have to remember that all of the classic Bird and Diz records of 1945, Groovin' High and Sure Enough and Salt Peanuts and all those things, they were Dizzy Gillespie records. Now, Charlie Parker was on them, but they were sold and made under the leadership of Dizzy Gillespie. So when Bird finally got his own session, he asked Miles Davis to play the trumpet. And we're going to hear one of the alternate takes from that session, the classic Billy's Bounce. But before we do, let's listen to a short reminiscence of Miles about what it was like being with Charlie Parker in those very early days when they were struggling and scuffling. Miles moved to New York, as I mentioned, to go to Juilliard. I'm not sure if it was legally his wife, but the mother of his daughter, Cheryl, came with Cheryl. Her name was Irene. Came to New York, moved in with Miles, and Miles helped Charlie Parker get an apartment in the same building. And this is what happened.
Well, first place, Bird was awful selfish. We never did talk. I had my wife, right? And I let Bird stay. I got him a room in the same place that we were in. So we didn't have much money, so I would tell Irene, I'd say, now fix some cornbread, and we'd buy some cabbage, put potatoes in, like cabbage. Bird come downstairs, right? Now the cornbread is this big, right? Now we don't have no money, just a little bit of it, right? So I said, Bird, you want something to eat? He come in. Now cornbread is like this, right? You cut this half, and eat the rest. So I called him again, and he did it again. So I stopped calling. But most geniuses are selfish. He did things in abundance, like shoot dope. He just took everything to the extreme. That's the reason he was like he is, what he is. What he still is.
Billy's Bounds from September 1945, Miles' first great record session with Charlie Parker. Lauren Schoenberg signing out. I hope you enjoyed this first edition of Sketches of Miles Extravaganza.